at number 10, modern day exorcisms. I think it's safe to say that most of us, at least me, assumed that the real life practice of exorcisms was a purely ancient and outdated ritual. Well, you might be surprised to learn that the Vatican has been known to perform them as recently as 2009. Not only that, but there is apparently a formal school inside the Vatican, and in 2018, 250 priests from all over the world attended the annual course. To make matters even more interesting, up until his death in 2016, there was a chief exorcist in the Vatican who claims to have performed a mind-boggling 130,000 exorcisms in his time. But it wasn't just him that performed them. Oh no, the Pope themselves have been known to get their hands dirty. When in 2009, Pope Benedict allegedly slammed Satan out of 2 men. And apparently in 2000, Pope John Paul II attempted one as well, but was unsuccessful, and later Father Ameth, the chief exorcist at the time, witnessed the possessed woman crawling up the walls like a spider. Next up, at number 9, the secret archives. Apparently within the Vatican lies a room coined the secret archives, containing all the documents the church has collected throughout the centuries. But just what exactly is written on these documents? Well, that is the one secret that will be tricky to get the answer to. While it's not entirely impossible to get access to these documents, they are extremely confidential and only a select few can see. But even then, it's not a free-for-all rummage. You must tell them what you are there to see, and you will receive only those documents to reference. I don't know about you, but it seems very odd that they're keeping whatever is in that room a secret. I mean, what is it that they don't want us to know? Next up, at number 8, tax evasion. It's pretty common knowledge that most churches around the world are tax exempt, and the Vatican is no different. Well, except for the scale. The Vatican receives a property tax break for all non-commercial properties containing a chapel. They've managed to figure out how to use this to their advantage, and between the years of 2006 to 2011, the Vatican evaded taxes that amounted to 4 billion euros. Like, think about how much money that is. Truly, it's staggering. But before you grab your picket signs and march down there yourselves, there was some justice. Thankfully, the European Court of Justice stepped in and ruled this completely illegal and forced the Vatican to cough up the cash as post-dated tax. But many argue that it wasn't enough. If you look back at accounts dating back to 1992, it's estimated that the Vatican has evaded nearly 13 billion euros, and that's just in the last 30 years. I don't even want to know how high that number could go if we dug even deeper. Next up, at number 7, bank dealings with the infamous World War II leader. The Vatican is a sovereign state, meaning essentially that they have legitimate and independent authority over their specific territory, even though the city resides within the borders of Rome. So, a part of this is that the Vatican has their own bank called the Institute for the Works of Religion, or IOR. But truthfully, the term bank is a bit of a stretch. Now, it's not the existence of the IOR that they don't want you to know about, but who they have dealt with financially. Apparently, during World War II, the Vatican received a considerable church tax from Germany's leader annually. The tax was paid via the IOR so that it couldn't be easily traced by Western banks. And through these dealings, the IOR became recognized as the world's top offshore bank. Now, we know the church stored billions of dollars in this account, but the full extent was never revealed to the public, so we will never know just how much the church actually ended making off of those evil fascists. Next up, at number 6, top secret court. Back in 1179, Pope Alexander created a secret court to handle sins of crimes based on conscience. The top secret court was a secret to the public up until 2009, but has been known to judge events on a wide spectrum, such as desecrating a communion wafer to priests breaking their vows of celibacy. Now, apparently the sinner who seeks absolution must write an anonymous petition to the Holy See, which is essentially the government of the Roman Catholic Church, Church, which will then be submitted to the tribunal, which is kind of like a board that rules for the court. The tribunal will consider the matter, but the ultimate decision lies in the hands of the major penitentiary, who is the highest ranking archbishop, and it is only if he cannot come to a decision that is then passed along to the Pope. Allegedly, up until the 18th century, crimes of SA and murder were judged by this tribunal. Next up, at number 5, post-war smuggling. Not only did the Vatican manage to make money off of the German war criminals for several years, but when all was said and done, they actually helped them escape the mess they had made. Understandably, after the war ended, Europe was not a big fan of the select German citizens that had caused an entire world war, so their solution was to flee the country and head towards South America. They apparently fled Europe using routes known as rat lines, and the Vatican knowingly gave them a helping hand. According to a researcher at Harvard, Gerald Steinecker, the Vatican's aid was based on the revival of European Christianity and the fear of the Soviet Union. And while that may be true, it's still incredibly hard to believe that someone actually pitied these people and helped them escape. To add insult to injury, the Vatican was often behind creating the false identities for the escapees prior to helping them flee. Next up, at number 4, Pope John VIII. Now, if you don't know, according to the Catholic Church, the Pope must be a man. No exceptions. It is one rule they have never broken. Or have they? As the story goes, many years ago, Pope John VIII was elected, but as it turns out, it was more of a Pope Joan situation. She traveled from Athens and through a series of dares, found herself elected as the Pope. But after becoming pregnant, she gave birth in the middle of the road, ruining her cover, and was dragged for miles by a horse until she died. By the time they found out, she had already reigned for 2 years, and incredibly embarrassed, they covered up the entire affair so as not to tarnish their reputation. The alleged Pope Joan was very intelligent and proficient in law, theology, and philosophy, and managed to disguise herself with no one the wiser for 2 years, which is an incredible feat, especially in her time. Next up, at number 3, dead man on trial. Back in 897, the Catholic Church actually put a dead man on trial. The trial was for the deceased Pope Formosus, and his successor, Pope Stephen VI, held it, accusing him of usurping the papacy. He had already been dead 7 months by the time he was put on trial, but nonetheless, they wanted to go through with it. They even assigned someone to speak on his behalf. Unsurprisingly, the dead man was found guilty, and all of his acts as Pope were declared null and void. His body was stripped of his sacred garments, and they cut off his 3 fingers of benediction. From there, he was cast into the river, the place where all the infamous criminals were disposed of for centuries. Coming in at number 2, Duplessis orphans. Flashback to 1940s and 1950s Quebec. Maurice Duplessis was the premier of Quebec at the time, and many of the social services were provided by the Roman Catholic Church. Now, because of the Catholic Church's belief that women needed to be married to have children, they would frequently urge mothers to give up their children to orphanages as they felt that the mothers were incapable of caring for them without husbands. Now, it gets sticky because not only is that just crazy, but many of these orphanages were operated by the church. Now, here is where Maurice Duplessis comes in. He discovered that he could get more money from the government if he declared the orphans mentally ill or unstable. Regular orphans would get him $1.25 a day, but psychiatric patients would get $2.75 a day. So under Duplessis, the provincial government deliberately misdiagnosed thousands of children for fiscal gain. These children were tested and abused and traumatized, all so that the government could make money off of them. And don't forget, the Catholic Church owned these orphanages, so they too made money off of it. And coming in in our number 1 spot, the Vatileaks. Back in 2012, an author named Gianluigi Nuzzi published a book entitled His Holiness, The Secret Papers of Benedict XVI, which contained confidential letters and memorandums from within the Vatican walls. How did he get all of this info? Well, the butler, of course. Paolo Gabriele, who had been the Pope's personal butler since 2007, aided the author by leaking highly classified information, for which he was later arrested by Vatican police in 2013. Now, with these documents leaked, authorities reviewed them and held an investigation to dive deeper into the scandal. It was uncovered that members from outside the Vatican were blackmailing secretly gay bishops, as the bishops were sleeping with them and not only breaking their vows of celibacy, but also hiding that they were homosexual, which, if you are unaware, is kind of a huge deal in the Catholic Church. With all the scandal of leaked documents, gay bishops, backstabbing butlers, the Pope eventually resigned in 2013, and the rest is history.
Starting off in our number 10 spot, we have the downfall. To start this list off, let's talk about one of the things that happened just before the transition into the first intermediate period of ancient Egypt. It is important to note some of the causes of the fall of the Old Kingdom, which is what brought forth this period of chaos and turmoil. One reason that is often cited is the extremely long reign of Pepe II, who was the last pharaoh of the 6th dynasty. His reign began while he was a child, and it is believed that he lived to possibly into his 90s, which, like, first of all, that's incredible. Imagine that guy with modern medicine and plumbing. I'm just saying. But, of course, while that's wild to see that long of a reign, especially back in those times, his lengthy life proved to cause some issues for succession because the guy outlived all of his heirs. Because of this sort of disorganization, it led to the regime of the Old Kingdom kind of being disintegrated. In our number 9 spot today, we have the Nile. The overflowing of the Nile was a very important time for ancient Egyptians. It is a super important cycle for them that was actually celebrated annually for 2 weeks. In the intermediate period, it is thought that the overflowing of the Nile, which really was necessary to their way of life, was lessened, or it may have potentially been non-existent for a period due to a drier climate, which is said to have potentially led ancient Egypt and its citizens into a terrible famine. The drier climate and the lack of the Nile inundation would have resulted in lower crop yields, which would have a significant impact on those living in the area at the time. In our number 8 spot today, we have disorganization. Like I kind of mentioned in the first point, part of the reason this intermediate period is often referred to as the Dark Ages is due to the lack of organization within the kingdom. Manetho, who is a historian and priest from the Ptolemaic era, would describe 70 kings who ruled in 70 days. This is likely a bit sarcastic and an exaggeration, but it's meant to show how chaotic things were at the time in terms of leadership. This period of time can sometimes be overlooked in terms of leadership because there is very little known about who was actually leading during this time. It is possible that the 7th dynasty may have been more of an oligarchy, which would have likely been composed of officials of the 6th dynasty. There unfortunately is very little in terms of both textual as well as architectural evidence that survived this period, so much of what really went on remains a secret. In our number 7 spot today, we have artifacts. During the time of the 7th and 8th dynasty, while it is true that we have little to go on, there have been a few interesting artifacts found that are believed to belong to this time period. There have been scarabs that have been found that are believed to have belonged to Neferker II of the 7th dynasty. There was also a green jasper cylinder that is believed to have come from the 8th dynasty. There was even a small pyramid that was constructed by King Ebi of the 8th dynasty that has been identified at Saqqara. While we have found these things, there are some rulers from this time whose positions remain unknown to this day. It is entirely possible that we may never know where some of these rulers lie. In our number 6 spot today, we have literature. While this entire period of time is incredibly interesting, one super cool thing is that the emergence of what is considered literature by our more modern standards seems to have occurred during this period of time. This led to the birth of new literary prowess in the Middle Kingdom, the age that came after this period. There is one specific piece that is very important historically, and that is the Ipuwer Papyrus. Although this piece of literature literature is not dated to this period, it is widely believed that it is likely referring to this intermediate period, and it records the decline in both international relations as well as just the general impoverishment that was seen in ancient Egypt at the time. In our number 5 spot today we have nomarchs. Another problem that really contributed to the fall of the Old Kingdom and the introduction into this more difficult period of time was the rise in power of provincial nomarchs. A nomarch was a provincial governor in ancient Egypt. Since the country was divided into 42 different provinces, which were called nomes, there would be a government official that was responsible for each one. Nearing the beginning of the first intermediate period, the position of nomarch had become a hereditary one, which of course meant that one family was likely to hold the position and the power for quite some time. This of course meant that these families, with every year, would only get more powerful and more influential within their nome, which left them becoming more independent from their overall ruler. These nomarchs were beginning to have their own tombs built, and they began putting together their own armies, and of course this went on to create conflict with those surrounding them. This not only created tensions, but it created warfare. In our number 4 spot today we have division. Once things kind of settled from the chaos of the fall of the Old Kingdom and the bizarrities of the 7th and 8th dynasties, it was realized that Egypt was now kind of divided when it came to ruling, as there were two competing power bases. One of those bases was at Heracleopolis, which was located in Lower Egypt, and the other was at Thebes in Upper Egypt. Those in Lower Egypt had their rule for approximately 94 years, and their kings comprised the 9th and 10th dynasties, each with 19 rulers. The founder of the 9th dynasty, Kheti I, is often described as quite an evil and violent ruler who caused a lot of harm to those living in Egypt at the time. It is said that he was, quote, seized with madness, which I'm not entirely sure what that means, but it is likely hinting towards some sort of mental health issue. In the end, it is said that he met his demise at the hands of a crocodile, which, I mean, leaves me with a lot of questions. In our number 3 spot today we have the buffer zone. Within the Heracleopolitan kingdom there was a powerful and wealthy province of Siut, or Asiut, which really rose to prominence during this otherwise difficult time. A new line of nomarchs began to rise out of this area, and they maintained quite a close relationship with the kings of Lower Egypt. We were able to discover this through what was inscribed on their tombs. These inscriptions provided a look into what the political situations were like during their reigns, and it describes this line of nomarchs as digging canals, reducing taxation, reaping rich harvests, raising cattle herds, and maintaining an army and fleet. Again, we are talking about a time that is referred to as the Dark Ages, so this sort of success was a big deal. Despite this thriving political situation, the Siut province acted as a sort of buffer zone between the dueling Upper and Lower Egypt, which means that it also bore a lot of the brunt of the attacks that were coming down to Lower Egypt from Thebes. In our number 2 spot today we have the Upper Egypt rulers. We spoke briefly about those who were ruling Lower Egypt at the time, so what about Upper Egypt? Well, the Theban kings are said to have been descendants of Intef, who is the nomarch of Thebes, often referred to as the keeper of the door to the south. Intef is often credited with organizing Upper Egypt into the independent ruling body from the south that it went on to become, but despite this it doesn't appear as though he ever tried to claim the title of king himself. Intef II began the attack of northern Egypt, and his successor Intef III completed that attack, which then left him to begin the move into Middle Egypt and the attack on Lower Egypt. The first 3 kings of the 11th dynasty, all named Intef, would also become the last 3 kings of the first intermediate period. In our number 1 spot today we have the Middle Kingdom. With all of the political chaos that was going on and with the competition for power, this resulted in a lot of violence. Prior to the military conflict, it is said that temples were pillaged, artwork was vandalized, and statues of different kings were destroyed. After the reign of the Intefs, they were succeeded by a line of kings who were called Mentuhotep. The second in this line is the ruler who would go on to eventually defeat the kings and rulers of Lower Egypt, those in the Heracleopolitan kingdom. This is important because it marked a new shift in ancient Egypt. This defeat marked the unification of the country, the continuation of the 11th dynasty, and it brought Egypt into the time of the Middle Kingdom.
Number 10. The Altamura Caveman. When researchers were exploring the cave of Lamalunga beneath the Italian town of Altamura, they were hoping to learn more about how the cave had been formed and its history. As they gazed around the limestone walls, their flashlights crossed a peculiar formation. It wasn't something normally formed in a cave, but appeared to be limestone nonetheless. Clambering over to investigate, these researchers soon realized that they were looking at no stone, no stalactite or gmite, but a skull. Indeed, this skull was ribbed with stony formations, the years of limestone dripping onto its face, allowing it to have the appearance of the surrounding walls. The body was investigated by more researchers and discovered to be a Neanderthal, the skeleton perfectly preserved by the cave's stagnant environment. How many visitors had visited this cave without knowing what secrets it held? Number 9. The Hubei Caves. We haven't crawled out of these caves yet, as our next stop on this ancient tour is Hubei, a province in China. When archaeologists explored a remote area near the Three Gorges Dam, they found a series of strange holes cut into a sheer wall of stone. Each hole was roughly cut, rectangular, and fairly deep. There's also the detail of the coffins that were sticking out of them. Yes, it seems that whoever built this ancient site did so with the intention of burying their dead inside of it. This correlates with theories of the time about how it was considered dangerous for people to bury their dead in the ground, for fear of animals stealing grandma for dinner. As a result, these coffins were designed to prevent animals from getting an easy meal, though it's unknown exactly how the coffins were carried to their locations. Carbon dating reveals that these burials were likely carried out by the Bo people, an ancient Chinese ethnic minority which was present during the Tang dynasty. Number 8. The Gaelic Tree Mystery. In 2015, harsh winds were responsible for uprooting a 200-year-old tree and a 1,000-year-old mystery. Located in Ireland, farmers were recovering from a recent windstorm when they went in to inspect the damages. It was likely a sobering sight to see a tree they might have known as a source of comfort or a location for friendly picnicking violently uprooted and slaughtered by the wind. What was then more immediately sobering was the skeleton found tangled in its roots. Hiring archaeologists, it was quickly revealed that the remains were of a young Gaelic man, roughly 1,000 years old. Despite his skeletal disposition, clear evidence of knife wounds were visible on his ribs and hand. Whether buried by his family or his murderer, none can say, and the case remains open to this day. Number 7. The Jigsaw Mummies. We're taking a much shorter trip around the world to Scotland, specifically southeast. This discovery honestly ought to be a fairly standard affair. Mummies and mummification have been widespread for an extremely long time. In general, mummies are mostly made through the dehydration of a corpse's flesh, which allows them to retain some of their appearance that they had in life. Bandages are not required. As a result, there are actually hundreds of mummies around the world, as depending on the environment of their burial, they could just accidentally end up that way. Egypt was the most famous for theirs because they were the first to dehydrate corpses on purpose, which is now wrong thanks to this discovery. As the mummies were investigated, it was revealed that they were deliberately mummified. Not only that, but more disturbingly, they weren't all the same. Analyzing the strange makeup of their body structure led researchers to realize that the mummies were actually constructed from multiple different bodies, each one using different parts. Number 6. The Hands of Egypt. On the topic of Egypt, which we briefly were, another secret was uncovered in the city of Avaris. Undertaking the excavation of the ancient and ominously named city, researchers discovered several pits in front of the palace, filled with 16 human hands. More interestingly, every single hand was a right hand. The reason for this is attributed to that hand having heightened cultural significance within ancient Egyptian culture, where the removal of a hand from an enemy combatant would allow a soldier to prove their victory. They could then exchange the hand for gold. Whether or not the disarmed opponent was dead or alive was apparently left up to the victor, as lacking their left hand would forever prevent them from participating in conflicts ever again, and mark them as a failure. Number 5. The leper warriors. Found within an ancient Italian cemetery, the bones of a warrior revealed a startling reality of the ancient military orders of the time. Prior to the establishment of cities within the region, nomadic peoples found themselves in constant conflict. That, mixed with the issue of leprosy and the lack of medical capabilities to treat it, led to drastic solutions which hoped to solve the issue. Not by curing leprosy, but by ensuring its victims could go out swinging. Employing lepers as warriors, these soldiers raged their way through the battlefield. The idea of hesitation, an out-of-style instinct when their life was already in the hands of God. One corpse from Campacharo even showed evidence of having survived a direct strike to the skull from an opponent's mace, and the after effects of ancient attempts at brain surgery. Pretty sick if you ask me. Number 4. Monk in a statue. While this image may have made its way around the internet, the story behind it certainly has not. When a trader of ancient Chinese relics sent his newly acquired golden statue of a sitting Buddha to an expert in order to restore it to its original splendor, they were shocked to discover that the statue contained a mummified corpse. When unwrapping this terrible gift, the name of the corpse was found to have been written on a bundle of cloth, dubbing the man as the monk Li Kuan. This gave evidence to theories of how the process of self-mummification rose to popularity, where the living person would slowly poison themselves to make their body too toxic for even maggots to eat. Anyone who completed the ritual would be revered and worshipped, their body encased in gold. So then, how many more of these statues might be needing a little x-ray? Number 3. Vampire burials. Honestly, I just want this to be a cover for a metal album. When digging up a mass grave in Venice, of which there are probably thousands, one corpse stood out as slightly unusual to archaeologists. Buried with a massive chunk of stone in her mouth, the corpse was confirmed to have been buried around the time of the bubonic plague. Since handling corpses would have been extremely stupid at the time, scientists decided to run a little investigation into the matter. Their results concluded that whoever had buried the woman believed that she might have been a vampire, and placed the stone in her mouth to prevent her from snacking on plague victims. This is similar to the Polish vampire burials that were also recently uncovered, where a woman was buried with a modified sickle placed around her neck. That's so metal. Number 2. Persian chemical warfare. When 19 Roman soldiers stormed a Persian tunnel, what they were met with would change the world forever in about 2,000 years. A wall of smoke enveloped them, melting their lungs. Their bodies would be found years later, desperately clawing at their armor. What this is attributed to is an ancient chemical weapon constructed from sulfur and bitumen being thrown into a fire. The smoke was then directed up into the tunnels, where it would turn into acid once breathed in by anyone who contacted it. A starkly brutal weapon and a reminder of the horrors of war. Number 1. Incorruptibility. This strange practice is generally held as a strong belief by the Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox denominations of Catholicism. The idea is that if a corpse is seen as incorruptible, they must be a saint, and the process of making a saint requires examination and bureaucracy. If judged well, the body is sealed in wax and put on display, where worshippers will gather around to view the holy figure. This practice has largely ceased in the modern era, but the bodies of saints are still on display to this day, their forms freely available for all to see. It's kind of weird.